In the spring of 1879, in a dry fold of the high plains east of the Front Range of Colorado Territory, a young widow stood at the top of 7 stone steps, with a lit lantern in one hand and a cold iron bar in the other, and looked down at a cellar door 3 men had told her never to open. The door was oak, banded in rust, and somebody had driven a row of cut nails through the frame and into the planks so that the whole thing was nailed shut from the outside, as though the danger were not what might get in but what was already there. She had been warned twice in the town, and once at the gate of her own land. She set the lantern on the step. She fit the bar to the first nail head. What she did not yet know was that the thing behind that door would take her 4 days to reach, and that when she reached it, she would understand at last why a wealthy man had spent good money to keep a poor widow from looking under her own house. Her name was Verena Tolliver, and she was 26 years old. And until that winter, she had not known how thoroughly a person could be erased by paper she never signed. She had come to the homestead 2 years before as a bride, behind a freight wagon loaded with everything she and her husband owned, which was not much. The land was a quarter section in a country that looked generous in April and turned to bone by August. There was a soddy with a board front, a dug well that gave hard water, a lean-to for the mule, and the cellar. The cellar was the one good thing on the place, and her husband, Mathis, had been proud of it. It was not a scraped hole like most. It was a true stone cellar, walls laid up in dressed sandstone and pointed with lime mortar, dry and cool and square, with those 7 cut steps going down. A man had built it to last. Mathis used to say that whoever laid that stone had known his trade, and that a cellar like that was worth more than the house above it, because a house could burn and a cellar would still be there holding your winter against the heat. He had not lived to fill it. In the second autumn, a fever took him in 11 days, and Verena buried him at the corner of the claim under a flat rock, and the neighbors came and were kind, and then went home to their own troubles, and she was alone with a mule, 160 acres of dry grass, and a debt she had not understood was owed. She had a skill, though. People who met her assumed she had none. A small, grave woman who said little, and they were wrong. Her grandmother had been a lime burner and a mason's widow in the old state of Missouri, and had raised Verena from the time she was small, and had taught her the one trade a woman of that house could carry. Her grandmother had known stone. She had known how lime was burned from limestone in a kiln, how it was slaked with water until it boiled and hissed and turned to putty, how it was beaten and aged and mixed with clean sand to make a mortar that would hold a wall for 100 years. She had taught Verena to read a wall the way other people read weather, to see where the mason had hurried and where he had cared, to find the one soft joint in a hard wall and know that the rest would be soft behind it. A wall tells you everything, her grandmother used to say, if you have the patience to let it. The trouble is that most people are in a hurry, and stone is not. That teaching was the thing Verena carried, and it was the thing that none of the men who came to her gate took into account. The first of them came in March, when the ground was still half frozen, and she had nothing but cornmeal and a little salt pork left in the dry box. He came in a buggy with a folding leather top, a stout man in a good coat, and he did not get down. He said his name was a name she would learn to hate, and that he represented the holders of the original patent on this land, and that her late husband had taken up the claim in good faith, but had been mistaken because the quarter section had been patented years before her husband ever saw it. And the patent had passed by sale into the hands of a company he served. He was sorry for her loss. He used those words. Sorry for her loss the way a man sets down a coin he does not want. The company was prepared to be generous, he said. They would pay her $40 to vacate by the 1st of May and forgive what he called the back rent, and she could keep the mule. He had the papers with him. He showed her a patent with a government seal and a date 11 years old, and a deed of sale, and a survey plat with her quarter section colored in. The names on the papers were strangers to her. Her husband's name was nowhere. Her own name was nowhere. It was as though the 2 years she had lived and grieved on that ground had happened to no one. Verena did not weep, and she did not argue. She had learned from her grandmother that there is a kind of strength in being slow. She said she would need to study the papers. The stout man laughed, not unkindly, the way a man laughs at a child who says she will buy the moon, and he said there was nothing in them for her to study, that the law was the law, and the seal was the seal, and that a sensible woman took the $40. Then he said, the thing that she would turn over in her mind for weeks. He said, you will want to be gone before the dry months, because there is no water on this claim worth fighting for, and you would do better to keep clear of the cellar, which is unsound, and let it alone. She had not asked him about the cellar. She had not mentioned it. He had brought it up himself out of nothing, and then changed the subject, as though he had not, and driven away in his buggy across the brown grass. A man who tells you not to look somewhere has told you exactly where to look. That night she went down into the cellar with a candle and stood among the empty shelves Mathis had built, and never filled, and she looked at the walls her grandmother would have admired, and she could not for the life of her see what was unsound about them. The stone was tight, the lime was good. She ran her hand along the joints the way she had been taught, and felt no give, no damp, no crumble, nothing but the cold square competence of a man who had known his work. The cellar was the soundest thing on the place. So why had a stranger, who had never been down those steps, told her it was not? She held the candle to the far wall, the north wall, the one cut into the slope of the ground, and she looked at it a long time. And there, in the seam where the floor met the wall, where the light pooled, she saw that the mortar was different. Not much. A person who did not know stone would never have seen it. Across one panel of that wall, though, perhaps 4 feet wide and running from the floor to a little above her waist, the lime was a shade paler, and the sand a shade coarser, and the joints were tooled flat where the rest were raked, and it had been done by a different hand than the hand that built the cellar. Someone had taken down a section of a finished wall and laid it up again, and whoever had done it had not been a mason. He had been a man in a hurry. She did not open it that night. Her grandmother had taught her never to break into a wall in anger or in haste, because a wall opened wrong can bury you, not because once you have opened it you can never close it the way it was. She went back up the 7 steps and slept badly and rose before light, and she began, the way she did everything. Slowly. First, she made it her business to learn who the stout man was and who he served. She drove the mule to the railhead town, a day's travel, and she did not go to the land office, where the seal and the law would only repeat themselves at her. She went to the people the law does not write down. She went to the woman who kept the boarding house, and the old freighter who had hauled in this country before the railroad came, and the blacksmith, and she bought a little, and listened a great deal, and over 2 days she put together the shape of the thing. The stout man's company had a clean name and a respectable office, and it held the patents on a great many quarter sections up and down the dry creek. And it had come into nearly all of them the same way. A family would take up a claim in good faith, prove it for a few years, build a soddy and a well, and then a man in a buggy would arrive with a patent older than their claim, and a survey that put their land inside a tract the company already owned, and the family, having no money for a lawyer and no faith in the courts, would take the $40 and go. It had happened a dozen times. The company never had to fight. The paper did the fighting, and the paper was always older than the family, and always sealed and always correct. And no one had ever once gone to the trouble of asking how a man could buy and patent a quarter section of empty grass, 11 years before anyone had ever set foot on it to survey it. The old freighter told her one more thing, almost as an afterthought, with his coffee going cold in his hand. He said that her claim, her particular quarter section, had not always been empty. He said that before the railroad, before any of the new families, there had been people on that exact ground. A man and his wife and their stock and a good spring that ran most of the year, and the stone cellar, which the man had built himself because he had been a mason in the old country before he came west. The freighter had hauled their flour out and their hides in for 3 seasons. And then one year he came and they were gone. The soddy fallen in, the spring gone to a trickle, and the word in the country was that they had given up and moved on to Oregon. He had believed it because there was no reason not to. Still, he remembered the man because the man had built that cellar with his own hands and had been proud of it. And a man who builds like that does not usually walk away. What was the man's name? Verena asked. The freighter thought a while. He said the name had been a foreign one, hard in the mouth, and he had called him by his trade instead. He had called him the Mason. The wife, though the wife had a name he remembered, because she used to sing while she worked the hides, and it was an old name, a Bible name. Susanna. He remembered the wife's name was Susanna. Verena drove home the next day with the name turning over in her. Susanna, the wife of the mason, who had built her cellar and then vanished into a story about Oregon that a man in a buggy would find very convenient. And she understood, somewhere on that long brown road, that the patch of new mortar in her north wall was not a flaw and not a danger. It was a hiding place. The mason had put something into his own wall before he disappeared, and someone else had told a poor widow to keep clear of the cellar, because that someone knew it was there and could not get it out without admitting he had ever been down those steps. She came home in the last light and stood at the cellar door, and she made her decision. She would open the wall, not the company's wall, not the law's wall. Her grandmother's kind of wall opened the slow right way by a woman who knew stone. She would need lime, because a wall opened must be a wall closed again, and she would not leave her cellar wounded. She had no kiln and no time to burn her own, so she spent 4 of her last dollars on a sack of slaked lime from the town and a measure of clean sand, and she carried them home like flour. She had her grandmother's tools, which were the only inheritance that had ever come to her whole: a mason's hammer with a worn ash handle, a set of cold chisels, a pointing trowel gone thin at the edge from years of work, and a heavy iron pry bar. She laid them out on the cellar floor in the lantern light, the way a surgeon lays out his steel. And before she struck a single blow, she did the thing her grandmother had taught her to do first, which was to look and look and look again, until she understood the wall, because a wall opened in ignorance falls on the one who opens it. She traced the patched panel with her fingers in the cold and found its edges, the line where the new work met the old. She found the place at the top where the man in a hurry had set a single stone crooked and bedded it in too much mortar, and she knew that was her starting point, because the crooked stone is always the loose one. She wet the joints around it with a rag, so the lime would not powder into her eyes. And then, on the morning of the first day, with the lantern burning and the door nailed open above her, she set her chisel to the mortar around the crooked stone and began, with the patience of a woman who has nothing left but time, to take her cellar apart one joint at a time. The work was slow, past the telling of it. Lime mortar properly made is nearly as hard as the stone it joins, and even this hurried mortar had set for years. She did not swing for the stone. Her grandmother had drummed that into her since she was a girl. You do not break the stone, you free it. You take out what holds it and let it come to your hand. She chiseled the joints, top, then sides. Then she worked the thin pointing trowel into the seam she had cut and felt for the back of the stone. And when she had cleared the bed, she set the pry bar and eased, never wrenched. And the crooked stone came loose in her two hands, heavier than it looked, the cold of years coming off it into her palm. She set it on the floor behind her, the first stone of her own house she had ever pulled. And she looked into the small black gap where it had been, and she felt the air. She had set herself a rhythm, and the rhythm was the only thing that carried her through. She would chisel until her hand ached, and her wrist would not close. And then she would set the hammer down and warm her fingers at the lantern chimney and study what she had uncovered. And then she would take up the hammer again. The cold of the cellar got into her by the second hour each morning and stayed in her until she climbed back up to the sun. Lime dust whitened her knuckles and the cuff of her sleeve, and the strand of hair that came loose and hung at her cheek. The chisel rang a small flat note when it found sound mortar, a duller note, almost a sigh, when it found the hidden hollow behind the stone, and she learned to listen for that change of note, the way her grandmother had taught her to listen for it, the wall telling her in the only voice a wall has. She blistered the heel of her right hand on the second morning and bound it with a rag and went on, because a woman who has buried a husband does not stop for a blister. By the end of the work, her palms had gone hard, in the places her grandmother's palms had been hard, and she understood for the first time, kneeling in that cold, what those hard places had cost the old woman, and what they had been worth. That was the thing she would remember longest. Not what she found, the air. When the first stone came out, a breath of air came with it, cold and close and old, the trapped air of a space that had been sealed up and not opened in years, and it smelled of stone and of dry earth and of something else, faint like old paper and old grease, the smell of a thing wrapped up and put away. She knelt at the gap a long moment in the lantern light, and let that old air move past her face. Behind the wall there was a hollow. The mason had not just patched his wall. He had built a chamber into it, a small dry vault between the stone and the earth of the slope. And he had walled it shut. Stay with me here, because what she did next she did not do for herself, and you may feel before the end that you have met her somewhere. She did not reach into the dark. She widened the hole. She would not put her hand into a space she could not see, and she would not pull the wall down all at once and risk the slope behind it coming in. Though she worked through the first day and into the second, freeing the stones one at a time, top course first, always top first, so the wall came down into her hands and not onto her head, setting each freed stone in order on the floor so that she would know how to lay them back. By the end of the second day, she had opened a gap the size of a small window, and the lantern light reached into the hollow behind the wall, and she saw what the mason had sealed up before he was driven off his land. It was not gold. The men who guard their thefts always fear that what was hidden is gold, because gold is the only treasure they understand. There was no gold. There was a wooden box, a small chest of pine boards dovetailed at the corners by a careful hand, sitting on a flat stone shelf the mason had built into the back of his vault, up off the floor where the damp could not reach it. There was a stoneware jar, sealed with wax, of the kind people put up lard or preserves in, and leaned in the corner. Beyond the box, wrapped in oiled canvas, gone stiff and dark with age, there was a long flat bundle, the height of a man, and she did not yet know what it was. She had learned that too. She brought out the pine box first, easing it through the gap with both hands, and carried it up the 7 steps into the daylight, because some things should not be opened in a cellar. She set it on the board step of the soddy in the clean morning light of the 3rd day, and she lifted the lid, which was not locked, because the mason had not been hiding his box from an honest finder. He had been hiding it from a thief who would burn it. Inside, wrapped in a square of waxed cloth, was the deed, not the company's deed. The original, a homestead patent issued by the Land Office of the United States, with the Great Seal and the eagle made out in a foreign name she could now read for the first time. The name of the mason, with the date of the final proof, and the description of the quarter section, her quarter section, granted in fee to the man who had built it, free and clear, 8 years before the date on the patent the stout man had waved at her from his buggy. The company's patent was the forgery. It had to be. A man cannot patent land that has already been patented to another, and here, in her 2 hands, was the elder grant, the true one, the one the company had needed to make disappear and had not been able to find because the mason had walled it into his own cellar and then been run off his land before he could tell anyone where it was. Under the deed there were letters. There was a marriage record. There was a small daguerreotype in a paper case, a man and a woman, stiff and unsmiling in their best clothes, the mason and his Susanna, looking out of the past at the woman who had finally opened their wall. And there was a book, thin ledger in the woman's hand, Susanna's hand, a diary kept in a plain, steady script. And it was the diary that told Verena the rest, because Susanna had written it down. She had written that a man came in a buggy with papers. She had written that the man said their claim was inside a company tract, and that they must go. She had written that her husband, the mason, knew the papers were false, because he had proved his claim honestly and held the patent for it, and that he had told the man so. She had written that after that the spring began to fail, the good spring that had run most of the year, and that her husband walked the creek above their land and found that someone had dug a ditch in the night and turned the water off into the company's tract, leaving them dry, so that the man in the buggy could say there was no water on the claim worth fighting for. She had written that they could not prove who had dug the ditch. She had written that her husband had said he would not be moved by a lie, and that he would take the true patent to the territorial court himself. The last entry was the one Verena read 3 times standing in the morning sun. Susanna had written that her husband meant to leave for the territorial seat the next week with the patent, and that she was afraid, and that if anything should happen to them, and a stranger should ever come to live in this house, she prayed that stranger would have the sense to open the cellar wall, because her husband had said that whatever the company did to them, they could not unbuild what was built into stone, and the truth would keep there in the cold and the dark until an honest hand came for it. Whatever you do, she had written, do not let them tell you the cellar is unsound and leave it be. They will tell you that. It is the one thing they are afraid of. Open it. The diary ended there. There were no more pages. Verena sat on the step a long time with the dead woman's book open on her knee, and the morning warmed around her, and a meadowlark sang somewhere out in the brown grass, and she understood that she was sitting on the porch of 2 people who had been robbed of everything, their land, their water, their good name, and very likely their lives. And that the lie about Oregon had been the last theft, the theft of even the knowledge that they had been wronged, so that the country could go on believing they had simply given up and moved along like everyone else. And she understood that the stout man in the buggy, or the men he served, had known the wall was there, had known the truth was in it, and had not dared to come and dig it out, because to dig it out, they would have had to admit they had been down those steps. and a man who admits he went looking for the deed he swore did not exist has hanged himself with his own rope. So they had done the only thing they could. They had nailed the door shut from the outside and told every poor frightened widow who came after that the cellar was unsound, and let the stone keep their secret for them, year after year, trusting that no one who came to that hard ground would ever have the patience or the skill to read a wall. They had not reckoned on a lime burner's granddaughter. She brought out the rest then in the full daylight, because she was not afraid of it anymore. The stoneware jar, when she broke its wax seal, held coins, not a fortune. The small, hard savings of a frontier family, a few gold pieces and a handful of silver, the money the mason had been taking to pay the court. She did not touch it for herself, and the long bundle in the oiled canvas when she carried it up and unwrapped it on the grass was the thing that finished the proof, because it was the survey, the original government survey plat of the township, the true one on its linen-backed paper, with the section lines and the corners and the notes of the deputy surveyor in faded ink. And it showed the spring, and it showed the creek running its natural course through the mason's quarter section before any ditch had turned it. The company's survey, the one the stout man had colored in, had moved the creek on paper. This one showed where it had really run. A man may forge a deed and even a seal, but he cannot forge the land itself, and here was the land's own record, contradicting him in the surveyor's own hand. She had it all now, the elder patent, the diary, the marriage record, the faces, the true survey, everything the company had needed to bury, sealed for years in the cold dark of a wall built by the man they had wronged, kept by the stone exactly as he had promised his wife it would be. Now I will tell you what she did with it, because what a person does at this moment is the whole measure of them. She did not take it to the stout man and throw it in his face. She did not want his $40, and she did not want his fear. She did not even take it first to the law, because she had learned in 2 years on that ground that the law moves slowly for the poor and quickly for the company. And she did not yet have the one thing that would make the law have to listen, which was a person with a name and a face and a right, standing in front of it. The mason and Susanna were dead. A deed in fee, however, does not die with the people who hold it. It passes, and somewhere there might be someone to whom it had passed. So Verena went looking, the same slow way she had looked at the wall. In the letters from the pine box, there was a return name and a town in the state of Iowa, a sister of Susanna's by the look of the hand, and Verena wrote to that name and that town a plain letter that told only the truth, that she was living on the old quarter section, that she had found in the cellar the papers and the diary of the mason and his wife, and that if there were any living kin she wished them to have what was theirs. She did not say what the papers were worth. She would not bait a hook with another family's grief. It took the rest of the spring and into the summer for the answer to come, because letters cross that country at the pace of mules and rivers. It came in the end. The sister had died years before, the answer said, written in a young, firm hand, but the sister had raised a child, the orphan daughter of Susanna and the mason, a girl who had been sent east as an infant before her parents were lost, too young ever to remember the dry creek or the stone cellar. Raised believing her people had died of fever on the trail to Oregon. The girl was grown now, a married woman with children of her own, and the letter was from her, and she wrote that she had spent her whole life believing she came from people who had failed and died, and that she did not know what to do with the news that they had instead been robbed and very likely killed, except that she was coming, she and her husband, as soon as the harvest was in, to see the cellar her father had built and to take up what was hers. Verena did not wait idle for them. Through that summer she did the other half of the mason's work, the half he had not lived to do. She closed the wall. She mixed her grandmother's mortar in a wooden trough, the slaked lime and the clean sand and the water, beat to a smooth putty the way she had been taught, and she laid the stones back into the north wall of the cellar, one course at a time, bottom first, now bedding each stone true, raking the joints to match the old work, so that when she was done a person could stand in that cellar with a lantern and never find the seam, because the wall was whole again, sound as the day the mason finished it, and the hollow behind it was empty now, its long duty done. She did it not to hide anything, but to heal it, because a thing built to last should not be left broken, even when its secret is out. Her grandmother would have run a hand along the finished joint and said nothing, which was the highest praise she gave. And she did one thing more. The spring, the good spring that had been turned off into the company's tract by a ditch dug in the night, she walked the creek above her land with the old survey in her hand, the true survey, and she found the cut, grown over, now, but still there, the scar where the water had been stolen. And with the mule and a borrowed scraper, and the better part of a week, she filled the company's ditch and opened the old channel the surveyor's notes described, and she turned the water back into the bed it had run in before any man in a buggy ever came to that country. It did not all come back at once. Water has a long memory and a slow forgiveness. By the end of that summer, even so, the spring was running again past the stone cellar, low but steady, the way it had run for the mason and his Susanna, and the grass came green along the old channel in a line you could see from the soddy door. The daughter came in September, with her husband and her 2 children, and a wagon, the way her own mother had come into that country a quarter century before. Verena met them at the gate. She did not make a speech. She took the grown woman down the 7 steps into the cool of the cellar her father had built, and she put the lantern in her hand, and she showed her the north wall, whole and sound, and told her that her father had laid every stone of it, including the ones Verena had taken out and put back, and that he had hidden the truth of their lives in it, because he believed stone would keep faith when men would not, and that he had been right. Then up in the daylight she gave the woman the pine box, the deed in fee made out in her father's name, the marriage record, the letters, the stiff little daguerreotype of the parent she had never known, and the diary in her mother's hand, the steady script, the last entry that had been written for exactly this stranger, on exactly this porch. She gave her the jar of coins her father had saved to buy justice and never spent. She gave her the true survey. She kept nothing. The grown woman read her mother's diary sitting on the same board step where Verena had read it in the spring, and she did not weep loudly, the way the men in the buggy would have expected a woman to weep. She wept the way her mother must have, quietly, working, turning the pages. And when she had finished, she sat a long time looking at the green line of grass that marked the spring, running again, and she said only one thing in a voice quiet but steady. She said, "They did not give up." Verena said, "No, they did not." And the 2 women sat together in the September light, not as friends exactly, they had only just met, but as 2 people who had each, in her own time, opened a wall the world told them to leave alone. What came after took longer than this telling, and the law came into it at last as it must, but it came on the daughter's terms and not the company's. With the elder patent in her hand and the true survey, and her mother's diary, the daughter and her husband took the matter to the territorial court, and they had what no other dispossessed family up and down that creek had ever had, which was not anger, and not a lawyer's cleverness, but the original grant, older than the forgery, in the true owner's name, and a record of the land's own water in the surveyor's hand, and the dead woman's plain account of how the theft was done. The company's patent could not stand against an elder one. The seal that had frightened a dozen families turned out to be the company's own undoing, because a forged seal is a crime, and once one forgery was proven, the court had cause to look at all the others. The stout man in the buggy was never seen again in that country. Whether he was punished, Verena never learned and never much cared, because her grandmother had taught her that the point of opening a wall is not to bury the man who built the wrong, but to free the truth he buried. The company unwound slowly, the way such things do. And some of the families who had taken the $40 and gone were found and made what restitution money can make, and the dry creek went back, quarter section by quarter section, to the people who had proved it. The daughter and her family did not take the homestead from Verena. The court restored the title to the Mason's heir as the law required, and then the heir, with the deed at last in her own name after a lifetime believing her people were nothing, did a thing the company would never have understood. She deeded the place to Verena. She said her father had built that cellar for someone who would have the sense to open it, and that someone had turned out to be Verena Tolliver, and that her father would rather his land belong to the woman who freed the truth than sat empty. She kept the diary and the daguerreotype and the deed in her father's name, the things that were her birthright, the proof that her people had not failed. She left Verena the land, the spring, and the cellar. Verena lived there a long time after the spring ran. He filled the cellar at last the way Mathis had always meant to, with the winter's stores ranged along the shelves he had built, and on the cool, dry floor of it she kept her grandmother's mason's tools. The worn ash hammer and the thin trowel and the cold chisels hung on pegs in the lantern light, oiled against the rust. Though she had no more walls to open, people in that country told the story for years, the way people do. And they mostly told it wrong, the way people do, making it about treasure or about ghosts, neither of which it ever was. The old freighter who had hauled the Mason's flour and remembered Susanna singing over the hides told it right when he told it at all. He said there had been a man who built a cellar so well that it kept the truth for a quarter of a century longer than the man himself was allowed to live, and a woman who came after with the one skill that could open it, and that between the two of them, across all those years and never having met, which was to outlast a lie. He said it took stone to do it, and patience, and the kind of woman the men in the buggies never bothered to count. If you have ever been told that something was unsound and best left alone, and felt in your own hands that the person telling you was afraid of what you might find, then you already know what Verena felt at the top of those 7 steps, and you may understand why she set the bar to the nail and began. The last thing to say is, the smallest. On the cool floor of that cellar for the rest of her life, in the lantern light, the thin pointing trowel hung on its peg with its edge gone soft from years of honest work, the one tool her grandmother had left her whole, and now and then Verena would take it down and turn it in her hand, the worn steel and the smooth wood, and run her thumb along the edge, and put it back. It had opened a wall the world said to leave alone. It had closed the same wall, whole again. And that her grandmother would have told you is the entire trade, and very nearly the whole of what a patient person can do against a powerful lie, and it had been enough. If this story moved you, you might sit a moment with the question Verena carried up those steps, which is how many true things are sealed behind walls we have all been told are unsound and best left alone. And if you would care to hear another account of a quiet person who would not be moved by a lie, there is one more such story waiting for you, of another dismissed soul on this same hard frontier who opened a thing the world had thrown away.